Welcome to the Nacogdoches Rd Church of Christ here in San Antonio, Texas. My name is David Jordan. I'm the evangelist here at the local congregation, and today's focus is on Reflection Monday. And so we're going to talk about 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5. Well, in verse 4 helps us to begin to understand a couple of things here. And God wants us to be a partaker of his divine nature. And so in doing that, when we are a partaker of God's divine nature, one of the promises we find in verse 4 is that we will have escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. And so another way we can understand that word corruption is also sin. And so we can escape the sin that is in the world through lust. Well, we understand that in 1 John chapter 2, verse 15, the Bible teaches us about all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. And so we understand here that every sin that a man or a woman commits falls into one of those three categories. And so the first promise we see in verse 4 is that if I'm a partaker of God's divine nature, I can escape that corruption that is in the world through lust. Well, that's a promise by which it requires faith to believe. And so we understand Matthew chapter 19, when Jesus is speaking to his apostles there, and he says, with man, it is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. Well, we get to verse 5, and now when we get to verse 5, we get to understand what divine nature is. And it says, but also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith. Well, that word diligence there means haste, with earnest. And so in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 27, we come to find out how important diligence is that God has given us. And it says, the lazy man does not take what he has roasted in hunting, but diligence is man's precious possession. And so we understand here that diligence is something that is needed to save my soul. You can be lazy with your soul today, or you can be diligent toward your God in saving your soul. And so, in other words, when we come to find out in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5, we come to understand what it really requires to be a partaker of God's divine nature. Well, here it is. It says that there are 7 things that we need to add to our faith. The first one is we need to add to our faith virtue. That's just moral excellence. And so I add virtue, then knowledge, then self-control, then perseverance, then godliness, then brotherly kindness, and then that final step is love. And we'll talk about love here for a minute. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 43, Jesus is teaching us that it's not enough just to love your brother or to love those who love you, but you have to understand that you even need to love those who persecute you, who you even would call your enemy. And so in Colossians chapter 3, it talks about love is the bond of perfection. And so these things are important, and these things also help us to understand God's divine nature. Why don't you come join us at the Nacogdoches Rd Church of Christ here in San Antonio? And remember, my friends, strength and honor.